marked up comics that were only weeks old and sold them for several times their cover prices. Speculators hoped they'd one day be worth as much as the collector's items from the 1940s.
And then the greed factor sort of set in with every publisher, where, they started producing alternate covers, special editions.
Sales went through the roof and into space.
Some books were selling like 6 million copies when there were only 500,000 readers. But these 500,000 readers were all, buying 2 and 3 and 4 editions of this particular book.
And because they were buying that many, the publishers were printing more and more and more copies.
You had a lot of adults and a lot of little kids who thought they were going to either get rich or put themselves through college on these books.
The only reason the old comics were going for a lot of money is they were rare. Nobody pays a lot of money for something that's all over the place. They were a glut on the market. When the fans started to try to sell the books they were saving and found they couldn't sell them, they stopped buying multiple copies. And suddenly the publishers were caught with these huge print runs.
We had a crash at the end of it we haven't seen to this day.
After 1993, thousands of comic stores closed. Hundreds of creators lost their jobs. By 1996, Marvel filed for bankruptcy. Monthly sales fell from 48 million to 7 million.
The medium almost died. It really almost died.
To make matters worse, a potential new generation of readers had other distractions: the internet and electronic games. The industry limped through the late 90s with stunts like finally marrying off Superman and Lois Lane and electing the evil Lex Luthor president in 2000. Superheroes spent most of their time in the world of fantasy until the real world intruded one September morning.
We used New York as a backdrop for all our books. We had to do something.
Comic book superheroes had been rebels and vigilantes in the social turmoil of the Great Depression, and then patriotic soldiers in World War II. They reflected the unrest of Vietnam and Watergate. At the start of the 21st century, most characters were more violent, more cynical, more sexually active than ever before. In other words, they reflected their world, as popular culture always does.
Comic books have been around since the dawn of time. They just weren't put on paper, they were put on cave walls. The stories of the great hunt, of the great droughts, of the great famines. Superhero comics are just an extension of that.
But sometimes, comics have anticipated reality. No one could have imagined September 11th unless they'd read comic books.
Osama bin Laden's plan was to create so much chaos and so much destruction that there would be a general war, and that Islamic fundamentalist or Islamist movements would take over governments and countries, even the United States. And when I heard that, it sounded like a comic book plot. It sounded like something Dr. Doom would do. We're going to create chaos and take over the world. Unfortunately, the real world looks more like a comic book world than ever before.
No longer are, 2 110-story buildings falling to the ground the stuff of fantasy. We felt it in New York when it fell. I felt the ground tremble.
As the quintessential New York hero, it seemed only right that Spider-Man would be personally affected by the attacks.
This picture of Spider-Man looking at ground zero, it's compelling, it's emotional. He represents all of us.
Frank Miller was halfway through his futuristic sequel to Dark Knight Returns when the towers fell.
I just, had a flying Batmobile go into a skyscraper and blown up half a metropolis. So it was an awkward moment for me in DC Comics. Because I was drawing this story while I was breathing in the World Trade Center in my Manhattan home. And I had to acknowledge it. And the only way I could do it was to have Superman in the wreckage of Metropolis, finding the locket of Lois Lane's and finding out that the love of his life was dead, and then move on.
Marvel, DC, Dark Horse, and Image put out commemorative comics that raised millions of dollars for the 9/11 victims and their families. Jim Steranko created a fundraising poster that recalled the glory days of World War II, when the superheroes were enthusiastically united against a common enemy. 21st century comic books had none of that.
I think it would be too corny, and it would be in bad taste to have a cartoon figure punching a Muslim and saying, "We'll get you." No, that wouldn't work today, I think.
A superhero's job isn't mourning the dead, it's fighting evil. And when your name is Captain America and your country is attacked, you have to do something.
It was the supervillain of the month that Cap would fight. And now the stories in Captain America are much more relevant. He's dealing with terrorism at home, terrorism abroad, making the book that much more relevant.
And yet Captain America suspects that his own government is hiding information about funneling weapons to terrorists. The World War II veteran is also haunted by parallels between 9/11 and the Allied firebombing of Dresden. That kind of political complexity is usually missing in action when superheroes leave the printed page for the mainstream media. Superhero adventures are often simplified on TV, in video games, and in movies. Nevertheless, with comic book sales dropping, those venues may be the superheroes' best hope for continued survival in the marketplace.
Every major motion picture studio and television network head is looking at comic books to find the next big franchisable hit.
But making a good superhero movie is tougher than it looks.
You know, I've seen Batman, I've seen Superman, Spider-Man, and I've seen Daredevil. Those movies are all wonderful on one level or another, but what they're missing is the characters' ability to internalize on a page, where you can read their thoughts and what's going through their mind.
Although they may be difficult to adapt, the fact that comic book characters and storylines are devoured by other media is a sure sign of the revered status comic books hold in pop culture.
The funny thing is now, the comic book is much more glamorous than having a newspaper strip.
Those of us working in the medium felt that we were working in a medium that was a despised art form, and indeed it was. We're at the cusp of acceptance as a valid art form.
But the respect comic books are now getting may be coming too late for the superheroes.
Comic book superheroes, in some ways, are more popular and more prevalent than they've ever been because of major motion pictures, video games, the internet, and so forth. And in other ways, you know, comic book sales of superheroes are at historic lows.
You went from easily being able to sell 1 million comic books to where the top-selling book in this industry to retailers is 150, 160,000.
To keep the industry going, publishers are exploring retail outlets beyond comic book stores.
While comic shops are always the core of our business, the fastest growing area is bookstores. The graphic novel and the collections that become graphic novels are really the future.
And of course, there's the internet.
Over the next 20 years, there will be more and more cartooning delivered online.
It'll never be as pleasant to read something on a screen as it is to hold it in your hand, to turn those pages and turn back.
We all love paper, don't get me wrong. But I think that electronic comics are really the way of the future.
Will superheroes be part of that future?
The ones that work are archetypes, made by people who believed and cared. Batman will still be around in 100 years' time.
I see a bright future for tights.
Precisely because it's the one genre that was created by comic books.
Comic book writers and artists are doing the same thing that storytellers did, drawing the pictures on the caves at Lascaux. We're using story to create context for life. On a very, very good day, and we don't have enough of them, that becomes art. On an ordinary day, it becomes escape. It's always magic.
Superheroes endure because they represent basic American beliefs. That there are choices to make between good and evil. That individuals can make a difference in society and history.